Thank you. I'd like to take a minute just to thank the hackconf organizers and those people that found the speakers for this conference, Teddy, Tony, the production engineers that were working on setting all this up. I heard that they worked all night, and when I got here this morning, I saw that they were hard at it. And I know this stuff takes a lot of work, so we really appreciate the effort that you guys put into it. I think you did a great job. So I'm really glad to be here. I lived in Bulgaria from 1993 to 1995. And in 2002, I opened a wholly owned subsidiary of my company in the U.S. here in Bulgaria. So I've been working here the last 17 years with offshore developers and with Bulgarians. And I've come over these years, these past 26 years, to love Bulgaria. And I really want to see Bulgaria, and I want to see Bulgarians succeed. And so I'm here today to warn you guys about something important. That is that your tech skills, they're commodity. Just because people are paying you a lot of money right now for what you do doesn't change this fact. And you have to be working as hard as you can to make yourself non-commodity. So I put up here a preview of some things that will help you do this, and I'd like you to take a few seconds right now to look them over. I want them to be in the back of your mind as I talk today. I have a friend in the United States, in Utah, where I live. He's a mortgage broker. So what that means is that he buys and he sells loans for homes. And this friend of mine, he's lived in my neighborhood 4 times now in 4 different houses. The housing market in the 2000s began to heat up, and as he got more and more successful and was making more and more money, and opportunities would open up to move into a different home, he would move into a different home. He liked the neighborhood, so he stayed there, but he kept switching houses. Eventually, as things got really warm, he was making a ton of money. He had opened up over a dozen offices. 15 in fact, and had people working in them, was selling a ton of mortgages, and he eventually moved out of the neighborhood. So he moved about 30 minutes away to a farming community, and he bought some land, and he bought a nice house, and he bought himself this Jeep. So a Jeep is a 4x4. You guys have probably seen them. They're really famous, and he probably had, I don't know, $35,000 or $40,000 in this Jeep. He didn't drive it every day. It was just a toy for him. There's this place in Utah that's called Moab, and it's beautiful. It has incredible scenery. It's really unlike anything most people have ever seen before. If you haven't been there, it may as well be Mars. It's so different. The landscape is so different, and there's this endless terrain that's there that is great for hiking and mountain biking, dirt biking, ATVing, really anything that you like to do outdoors. And it's one of Utah's many phenomenal playgrounds. It happens to be a premier destination for jeeping. And my friend with this nice Jeep that he built, he goes down there a couple times a year to play. And out there, there's this trail. They name all these trails, 100 of them out there, and they rate the trails on difficulty. And there's this trail called Hell's Revenge. And there's this obstacle on the trail. It's this broad swath of slick rock. It's like a super highway of rock, and we drive around in these Jeeps, and out there's this big hole in the rock. And they call that hole Mickey's hot tub. So my friend with his Jeep, he decides that he's going to try to go through Mickey's hot tub, and he takes his Jeep, and he drives down into this thing. And when you drive into it, it's not very steep. But as you try to drive out the other side, it gets really, really steep, and he can't get the traction that he needs to get out of Mickey's hot tub. And so he gives it some gas, and he gives it some gas, and the front end starts hopping. You can see this on YouTube, by the way. It's got 1.3 million views, last I checked. And he rolls his Jeep over backwards. He totals the Jeep. Funny thing is, look at his face. He's smiling. Why? It's no big deal. The money's flowing, Jeep gets fixed, Jeep even gets upgraded. He's back in business, life is good. But about the time that this Jeep wreck is going on, there's also a train wreck that's going on. The housing bubble bursts in the US, and it's a total catastrophe for the economy. My friend's cash flow, it dries up, and then it just completely reverses. And this is on a major scale, and he winds up bankrupted. He loses the land, he loses the house, and he loses the Jeep. You see, my friend was selling a commodity. The market economics were perfect for it at the time because everybody was buying houses. Everybody was upgrading their house. And he took advantage of the economics. And why wouldn't he? The rest of us would too. But when the demand dried up, there was way too much supply. And the market didn't need him because there were a million others that were just like him. In organizations, there is this age-old debate between sales and engineering. The sales guys, they say, look, if we didn't sell, you wouldn't have a job. And the engineers say, well, great, if we didn't build product, you wouldn't have anything to sell. I want you guys to understand that in this argument, in my experience, sales is king. I believe in a pyramid model. And the customer is at the top of that pyramid, and everybody below the customer supports the levels that are closer to the customer. In software development, what this means, you've got customer, you've got sales, you have product ownership, and then you have engineering. It means that engineering is at the bottom of the heap. So engineers support product owners. Engineers are, in fact, commodity. You buy them, you sell them. I can get a .NET SQL developer who is working on a banking product. I can hire him, I can put him on a healthcare product, and his skill set transfers smoothly. I can't take a banking subject matter expert who is working on a banking product and move them to a healthcare product and have the transition go smoothly. So I'm going to say it again. Engineering skill sets are commodity. I'm on an airplane in 2015. I'm flying out of Sofia. And I'm reading the in-flight magazine on Bulgaria Air. And in it, there's an article in the January 2015 issue. And it says, according to the Bulgarian Industrial Association, from 2008 until the third quarter of 2014, the average wage in Bulgaria grew by 49.5%, under an approximate 14% real growth of productivity. Now, I'm not an economist, and I don't want to start an economics fight here, but I do want to say that as a person who buys services from Bulgaria, nobody who buys services from Bulgaria is going to like this statistic. My friend, when he wrecked the Jeep, he actually got surprised by both crashes, the Jeep wreck and the train wreck that was going on in the housing market, because, at least in part, because the good times were making it hard for him to see the risks that were out there. In the tech industry, we also have risks. Those risks include globalization. They include the commoditization of technology. They include artificial intelligence. They include new labor markets. We simply can't afford to be complacent just because the picking is easy right now. The economic reality is we are commodity if we don't produce value that the next person or labor market or technology cannot produce. And when the bubble bursts, like it did with the mortgage industry, and like it has before in the tech industry, we won't survive against cheaper providers of the same commodity. For those of you that aren't old enough to remember it, there was a tech crash in 2000 that's now called the .com crash when exactly this happened. And you guys need to understand that with what's been going on in the last 20 years here in Bulgaria, Bulgaria simply isn't the cheapest producer of software in the world anymore. And this is not by a large margin. So how do we survive? The fact is that not all is lost, but we have to maintain a relentless focus on delivering value. So there's something that I call a value curve, and we can graph it. On your y-axis, we have value. On the x-axis, we have time. And almost every team that I've ever worked with produces a value curve that looks something like this. And they build and they build and they build. Foundation, scaffolding, architecture. Božidar talked about this today. How long it takes projects that you think are going to take 6 months, how long it really takes them. And there's all this promise that it's going to pay huge returns as soon as it's ready. And guess what? It sucks. And you know why? Because time equals money. So the business is in a bunch of money. And what do they have to show for it? Nothing. It upsets them. And it should. The team loses credibility. And they should. The team says, hey, we just need another sprint or two, and the business doesn't believe them. The business thinks they're headed for 2 times the cost, and there still won't be any value. And guess what? They're probably right. So we need to do everyone a favor, and we need to consciously strive for a value curve that looks like this instead. And this isn't necessarily a novel idea. There are people that have written on this. Sometimes they call it concavity. Sometimes they call it convexivity. When the business sees good early value, they recognize your value, and they should. The team gains credibility. When the project slows down, the business trusts the team productivity. All projects over time develop friction. Quality becomes more important than speed of new features. Customers want slower upgrades because it's painful for them to do the upgrade in the first place. Teams and dependencies get added. Code bases become more complex. Technical debt gets incurred. In this type of curve, even though the new value that's added starts to slow down, what is lost in new value gained or in new value added is gained in sustained value over the time. Now, the business eventually spends the same amount of money that they would have in the first place, but they have revenue to sustain that ongoing investment. And that makes all the difference. We need to own our value. We need to align our value curve with how our organization measures or judges value. Now, there are some ingredients to value, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them. I think these are maybe the 3 most important ingredients that I've identified over the years of playing this game. One of them is technical capability. So for all this talk that your skill set is commodity, you still need it in order to add value. But we assume that this technical capability is there when we hire you. If we didn't, we wouldn't have hired you in the first place. Once we hire you, you need to continue to sharpen your skills. Even though they're commodity, you need to continue to sharpen your skills. But I want you to remember something. The strength of your technical capability is irrelevant to either one of those value curves. When you're working on, it's irrelevant to which either one of those value curves. And the reason it's irrelevant is that if you're working on the wrong things in the wrong order at the wrong time, you aren't adding value no matter how strong your technical skills are. Now, the second thing is product capability. Product capability comes from your product arm. A piece of advice that I have for you developers is to not hijack her backlog with your technical stories. I see this recurring case all the time where a product owner comes and sticks a functional story on the backlog, and the team says, we need to add a couple spikes to figure out what we're doing. So they throw a couple spikes on the board. Well, those 2 spikes then turn into 10 technical stories. And now they've got 10 technical stories, and the team is working on these technical stories. What happens to the functional story over the next 5 sprints while they're working on these 10 technical stories? It gets carried over from sprint to sprint to sprint. What does that do? Well, guess what? Sales isn't going out and selling those 4 third normal form tables that you created in your database to the customer. And so they're not generating revenue. They're not generating value for the organization. This is exactly what I'm talking about, that it stretches this value curve out to the right instead of making it convex. You need to support your PO and to help her succeed. POs, for all you POs out there, don't get lazy. Focus on the strength of your backlog. The strength of a backlog, I measure it by the quantity and the quality of the stories that are in it and how well those stories are organized on the backlog. Here's what happens if you get lazy as a PO. Product ownership begins to filter down into the team. A team that's been on a product for 20 years doesn't really need a PO. They know everything about the product. They talk to the sales guys at the water cooler. They get on customer support calls. They understand what the problems are and what the customers are complaining about. They're staring at the functionality that is there day in, day out. They understand how they can make it better, how they can make it perform faster. When that happens, what do you need a PO for? The same thing happens when a PO is writing really high-level stories and expecting the team to munge those stories down into detailed stories. Essentially, the team is doing the product ownership work. As that filters down, if the team is doing that product ownership work, what do we need the PO for? What is the PO? The PO is friction at that point. The third thing here is system capability. Now, system capability it's a form of technical capability, but it's system specific. It's data models. It's security and authentication. It's architectural constraints or services or logging. And in order to develop system capability, you have to learn the system. In addition to learning the system, you need to find the right people who can help you acquire the system capability that you need. And then you need to make it easy for them to help you. Now, I want to make one other point while I'm sitting on this slide, and that is that it's really hard to build value if you're moving around from company to company all the time. Moving around a lot may help to build technical skill set, but it comes at the cost of product and system capability. How do you get to know a product overnight? How do you get to know a system overnight? And so a piece of advice that I have for you is to find a place that you love to be and where you can add value, and then stay there as long as you can. There's something out there that is called the Keyhole Effect. I call it the Keyhole Effect. And the idea is this, that keyholes exist between any 2 groups, even groups of 1, that are communicating. And they're interesting because I feel like you can either look through them or listen through them or speak through them, but you can't do any more than one thing at a time through them. I see keyholes between sales and engineering, between the business and engineering, even between business and sales. I see keyholes between any 2 teams. I see keyholes between architecture and dev. I see keyholes between friends, and I see keyholes between spouses. And I believe that keyholes are the enemy of product capability and system capability. And so they're the enemy of adding value. And there's an inefficiency coefficient anytime communication goes through a keyhole. Everything is restricted. You don't get the full picture. I'm looking over there at the business, and they've just pivoted their requirement for the 15th time on me in the last 2 weeks. And I've had to restart my sprint again, and I'm upset about it. And I wonder to myself, are they idiots? Why did they do this to me? And I can tell you that they're not idiots. What it really is we don't see everything that they see. And as we look through this keyhole, we just have limited vision. And so it's hard to get the full picture. Another problem with keyholes is a lot of times they get out of sync. So I might have one person on one side of the keyhole, and they're talking through the keyhole, and the person on the other side of the keyhole, they're looking through the keyhole. And I might have someone who is looking through the keyhole on one side, and the other person's listening through the keyhole. Or maybe both people are talking to each other, and nobody's listening to each other. I found that when you're communicating through a keyhole, it's easily an inefficiency coefficient of 10x, and it's often much more than that. Maybe it's 100x in a lot of cases. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Maybe you guys have seen this. I see it all the time. I get a product owner who is remote from the team. And the product owner comes to a planning meeting or a refinement meeting, and they're talking to the team, and the first thing is there's a Scrum Master who's co-located with the team, and the Scrum Master is driving the board. And the product owner says, hey, will you open that story that talks about X? And the Scrum Master goes and opens a story that talks about X, and the product owner says, no, not that story. I meant that other story. So the Scrum Master closes out of that story, and they open up a different story, and the product owner says, no, not that one, 2 down from that one. So they go down 2 and open that, and says, no, that's not the one. I actually meant next column over and 1 up from there. And they go and they open that story. Now, how long did that take for the product owner to drive the Scrum Master to open a story? And how long would it have taken if the product owner were driving and had just opened up the story that they knew that they wanted to show the team? The keyhole effect and this inefficiency coefficient happens to be substantially worse when the team is offshore from the customer, from the organization, meaning the product organization. A lot of you are offshore. You're offshore services. And it's tough because you have language differences and you have cultural differences and you have time zone differences that really impede things. And so the strategy for dealing with that is to reduce and to optimize communication that's running through the keyhole. I ask my teams to isolate heavy lifting onto one side of the keyhole or the other in order to eliminate communication that has to pass through the keyhole. I ask my teams to shrink the communication that goes through the keyhole as well in order to optimize it. So an example of heavy lifting is the refinement process. If I can have a product owner that works with an engineer who is in the room with them around a whiteboard, and they can refine a story together in the same room, it's pretty efficient. And the two of them together can optimize and the communication that's going to the offshore team and can preempt a lot of the questions that are going to come from the team. Once we get the team on the phone and we're communicating through the keyhole, we've got 8 people on the telephone, and the inefficiency is exaggerated because of the number of the people that are on the phone. That's what I mean by isolating. On the side of the engineers, when they have a problem and they need help with system capability, if they take the time to build a flow diagram and to really understand the problem and to understand the language of the person they're going to be asking for help from, then it saves a bunch of time when they get that person on the phone and makes the communication more efficient. For shrinking communications, one of the best things that I've found for it is to ensure that stories are very, very small and end-user testable. You can also develop soft skills to help communication move more efficiently through the keyhole. These help you to create a team with the PO or the subject matter expert. By soft skills, what I mean is how you talk to them, how you listen to them, how you own your task. Not the technical one, but the value-creating one. How you help your PO avoid risks and how quickly you adapt when the business pivots. Another piece of advice here is to always use the best possible method of communication when talking to the keyhole, and I'll give you a hint, it's never email. Domain language helps a lot when it's available, and when it's not, learn the language of the person on the other side of the keyhole and use it instead of your language. And I'm not talking English and Bulgarian here. I'm talking product and tech, for example. Finally, know when to communicate. So be aware of the time zone you're in versus the person that you're communicating with, and know how to communicate, which is really a cultural question. So I'm going to come back here to my slide, my original slide of how to survive the commoditization of your job. Own your value. Remember that it is you who owns the value you add or you don't add. It's your responsibility because you're the one who is selling your wage. Don't get complacent. Times may not always be so good, so don't be surprised by a crash that happens. Always strive to add value. If you're going to do one thing, think every day, am I adding value? How am I adding value? And what does my value curve look like? Value is never commodity. You have to know your organization and how they judge value, and then consciously align with how they judge that value. Do keep your skills sharp, your tech skills sharp, even though they're commodity, you really can't succeed without them. And support your PO. Speak her language. Don't put technical stories on her backlog. If she's functional, obviously. Learn the bigger system you're part of. Identify key resources who can help you, and then make it easy for them to help you. And then do everything that you can to mitigate the keyhole effect by reducing and by optimizing communication that goes through it. Over the past 26 years, you guys have been good enough to share Bulgaria with me. And I really do love you for it and love Bulgaria for it. And so I want to extend an invitation, each and every one of you. I want to share Utah with you guys. So if you would like to visit Utah, reach out to me. I'd love to host you. I'd love to talk tech with you. I'd love to take you around and share the many great things that Utah has to offer you guys. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here today with you.